Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. I'm your host, Justin, here with a very special guest, everybody. Is the Millennial-Review's resident Haiti expert. She has a master's degree in Latin American studies with a geopolitical focus on Haiti, and she's here to discuss the current unrest in Haiti with me. Is none other than Chel, great friend. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, it was a great introduction,
It
and
was a very good introduction.
I was energetic. I was into it,
I
but
could feel
really,
that energy too.
it's good. I hope the listeners can feel it as well because I really am excited to have you on the podcast generally, but also I guess it's not really exciting to discuss what's going on in Haiti because it's pretty chaotic and not good for the people of Haiti, but maybe potentially someday it will be. And I just think generally it's a story that people should probably know more about.
I mean, this is definitely a flashpoint in Haitian politics right now, and uh, obviously the hope is that we'll look back on this period as a critical moment where things shifted for the better. That's what we hope, but obviously reality sometimes has other ideas, so only time will tell.
Only time will tell, which isn't always a good thing. But from like the 30,000 foot view, I guess, for the uninitiated, which I am mostly the uninitiated, what is going on in Haiti right now? And I will get into the history and context a little bit after that. But just like, what's the political situation like? And then we could speak to the situation like more on the ground. Obviously, those are like one and the same on some level, but you know what I mean? The like Haitian
Right.
politics sense.
Well, the 30,000-foot view essentially of what's going on right now is that there's a constitutional crisis in the country. There's a constitutional crisis that is founded on a disagreement about what the Constitution says about the presidential terms and the presidential term limits in Haiti. Essentially, Jovenel Moise, who is the current president of Haiti, or who is currently in that position, many people would argue unlawfully or illegally, based unconstitutionally. Uh,
And probably emphasis on currently. That could change at any
right,
moment
it
given
could
the
change at any
instability.
moment, but essentially, he is occupying this office unconstitutionally. His mandate ended on February 7th, 2021, which is just a few days ago. However, he and his loyalists are arguing that his mandate actually ends on February 7th, 2022. There's some constitutional basis of this argument. However, I would say that the majority of the Haitian people have decided that his mandate is over based on the Constitution. So you're seeing lots of civil unrest in the country right now. There are also many, many other reasons why people are currently and have historically been protesting against Jovenel Moise. He has proved to be a corrupt neoliberal uh, official, and
Hate to see it, folks.
you hate to see it. Nothing less than we would expect of being the handpicked successor of a handpicked Clinton uh, candidate in Haiti. But
Yeah, go into that dynamic, I guess, to bring it back a little bit because we were discussing before we recorded, like you can kind of obviously you could trace all this way back, and we'll probably do a little bit of that, but like as far as the more modern context goes, tracing it back to like 2011 and the Clintons and all of that, like what does that story look like a little bit, and how does it play into really like both the constitutional crisis element here, but also the like unrest on the ground that crisis is breeding.
so in 2011, obviously Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State under Obama, in the Obama administration. Um, she obviously, and her husband, Bill Clinton, you may or may not have heard of him. Uh,
Who's that guy?
yeah, I don't really know. I think he plays the saxophone or something.
I heard about that one. Yeah.
They're obviously very invested in the politics of Haiti. They run
Quite literally.
very quite literally invested in the politics of Haiti. Bill Clinton at one point was the special United Nations liaison for Haiti in the United States. Uh, they're very invested in the politics, both monetarily and politically. In 2011, obviously 2011 was the year of the earthquake that really devastated Haiti.
Yeah, but then the world came together and built back better for Haiti, just like Joe Biden
That's
would say.
precisely what did not happen.
So I just before you dive into that, because I feel like it's shameless how marketed those events are, and how like it became like an entertainment event to like raise money for Haiti, but it didn't materialize into like anything when you look at what's
Well,
happening
it became
now.
an international spectacle of kind of this poverty pornography of
For
the
sure.
international community, like looking kind of in horror, and the media circus around the earthquake really did put a lot of attention on Haiti, but particularly it was really a spectacle of the suffering of Black people that was what resulted from rather the earthquake.
Totally. And then the like obvious like physical material devastation there, and the like need to rebuild the infrastructure. Like when you listen to or read reports of what's happening now, like some of the infrastructure that is in ruins isn't like new because of the civil unrest or anything. Like that is just things that were not fixed because this like international effort was botched on so many levels, and it didn't materialize in a lot of ways.
Precisely. And in January of this year, 2021, we just had the 10-year anniversary of the earthquake. And like you said, we're still not any better in many respects in the country of Haiti than we were in 2011, immediately after, in the aftermath of the earthquake. So
Totally.
all of this international aid really amounted to nothing. There were billions and billions of dollars that we don't really know what happened to it. It really is very hard to track what ever happened to all of this international aid. Um, but what I'm talking about here isn't necessarily like the Clinton Foundation's monetary aspects, but more of the United States, and particularly Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, really endorsing the who would become the president of Haiti, Michel Martelly, also known as Sweet Mickey. He's a singer, or he was a singer before he became president of Haiti.
Some bops out there.
It is kind of, he does kind of produce bops, but he's kind of an awful person, so I try not to bop to it.
Yeah, don't bop to it.
Um,
Research bopping only.
But Michel Martelly was one of the founders of the Tête Calais party, which is the party that's currently in power in Haiti. It's the party that Jovenel Moise is a part of. And they really had a lot to do with a lot of the embezzlement and the money going missing after the earthquake and the aftermath of the earthquake. Um, so, really, a very corrupt neoliberal party that was taking a lot of money internationally and then pocketing it and putting it into the pockets of themselves, their families, their close associates, while none of it was actually getting down to the people of Haiti where they needed it most, in infrastructure of hospitals, roads, schools, things like that.
And what, I guess, how does that play into the history of trying to get aid for Haiti, and trying to like make I guess generally that's the sort of thing that's like wielded against like international aid, like as a general matter, against like by conservatives, and it like really defeats the like actual need for it. And in situations like this where it's explicitly politicized around corruption, around those issues, and it's a big facet of the political crisis, like how does that play into actually solving the political crisis? And I guess like institutionally speaking, I know, like, can you speak to the erosion of Haitian institutions in this moment, like what that means for actually delivering aid, and like how that's played out over the last decade or
Well,
so?
obviously, the rampant cases of embezzlement and fraud erode trust and faith in institutions, and they also erode the institutions
For
themselves.
sure.
In terms of international aid, uh, nations aren't likely to give aid. In fact, right now it's standing policy in the United States that aid is not given directly to the Haitian government. It's given to non governmental organizations and nonprofits, which, to be fair, also doesn't really solve the problem, because what it is that it creates this sea of nonprofits that are operating in Haiti They're operating with very little oversight. They're not accountable for the money that they have. And so you have all of these American nonprofits, American, French, Canadian, many nations do it. America is one of the worst. But Haiti has the highest number of nonprofit organizations per capita in the world. And when you think about what that means, is that nothing has actually come out of it. It's not suddenly a better, more stable, more secure, better infrastructure. It doesn't have any of those things, even though we are still receiving all this nonprofit money into the country, mostly into foreign owned nonprofit companies. Very little of it makes its way into the hands of Haitian owned nonprofits.
And what does the work look like there, I guess, because it seems like there's obviously a huge need, the money's there, but like how does the political instability play into the I guess into the inability to deliver it, or is it just like simply it's just not happening, they just taking the money and it's just like it is rampant grifting in
I
that
think that
way?
there is rampant grifting. I think that, you know, I don't want to generalize and say that every single nonprofit in the country
For
is
sure.
horrible. What I am saying is that the institutions that have built around this kind of cabal of nonprofits is fundamentally broken and not effective at all.
No, and to be fair, like just to like not make this all about the like ineffective aid in Haiti, a lot of American nonprofits you could make similar critiques of. So like not to just bash what's going on in Haiti entirely, but I guess to bring it back out to like the 2011 and the like Clinton like secretary of state sort of handpicking this political party, handpicking this political project in many ways. Like what has the continuation of that looked like, and how does that play into the modern political crisis in Haiti? Like what exactly is that dynamic like, and I guess what does the United States relationship with Haiti right now in this like pretty chaotic moment speak to, like that how does that speak to that relationship as well, and is it changing, like what's that look like?
Well, I think that the continuation of 2011, Haiti has 5-year presidential terms, and so Michel Martelly, who was the president, was chosen to be the president in 2011. His term finished in 2016. There's a really chaotic election season that happens in 2015, extending all the way into 2016, because what happens is that elections are held on October 25th of 2015 in order to determine who the next president of Haiti will be. That president is supposed to take office on February 7th of 2016. However, there are accusations after the election in October of rampant fraud. So Jovenel Moise of the Tête Calais party, who, like I mentioned before, had been hand chosen by Michel Martelly in order to lead his party into the next presidential election, he came back with 32.8% of the vote. Trailing just behind him was Jude Celestine, who was the candidate for the La Paix party, which was another kind of less right, but still a center right party. And then two kind of left parties, the Plateforme Petite Dessalines and Famille Lavalas, were trailing behind them at 14 and 7% of the vote. Immediately after this election, Jude Celestine says, "This isn't right. We know that there's been fraud going on." Internally, there are auditors in the government who say that there are vast irregularities in this election. However, international observers from the OAS and from the United States say, no, there's no irregularities here. Uh, we
Only in Bolivia.
we spent 33,000 or excuse me, $33 million on this election. There's no fraud. The people of Haiti need to accept democracy, and they need to accept the candidate that has been chosen.
And
Um,
maybe you can keep going if this isn't a good time to address this, but like what is the motivation there historically, I guess? Like can you speak a little bit to the role Haiti plays with the OAS, and like we discussed that a little bit, like because I think that that's important context as far as like there is inconsistency in the politics of the developing world as far as the United States playing their own geopolitical game, and like Haiti is a big part of that in the especially in the context of some of the other political struggles in like South America we've discussed on the podcast, specifically Bolivia, as I joked about. But like it's real that like there's a disconnect in how the OAS treats those things, and there are very like there's structural and historical dynamics at play there that I think like motivate the United States' thinking regards to Haiti and regards to Bolivia. And I guess like you have the Haitian context there, so
Well, the context with the OAS, particularly in the OAS, historically, two times this has happened. One was in the presidency of Jovenel Moise, and one was in the 1960s. So within the OAS, the United States often counts on Haiti to be a deciding vote in the OAS. And so Haiti was a deciding vote when Cuba was expelled from the OAS in the 60s. Haiti also became the deciding vote when Venezuela was expelled from the OAS just a couple years ago, and that was when Jovenel Moise and Trump kind of became buddy buddy. Um, so there is kind of an outsized role. Haiti is a small island country. It is a country of 10 million people. But it plays an outsized role in the OAS in terms of voting power, and the United States often counts on Haiti to back them up on these kinds of votes. Haiti has also been a very kind of staunch, like if you're going all the way back to the Cold War, Haiti plays a very staunch anti-communist place in the Caribbean and in the broader Latin American context.
so
Um,
just like on that, like what component of Haiti's current political posture, in your opinion, is like continuing that tradition, or was that like broken at some point and now it's just like geopolitically advantageous to do it again?
No, absolutely. I think that while the Cold War is obviously over, or at least nominally is over, um, Haiti still has that kind of legacy of being a foothold for the United States in the Caribbean, of being against leftist politics. And you can see that in the election and the subsequent coup against Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was a leftist presidential candidate who became president in Haiti under the Lavalas party, and he was abducted in the middle of the night put on a plane to Central Africa and dumped, essentially, um, by a United States backed coup. So
Oh, they
this
didn't officially play a role in that, did they? Like
oh
that's the playbook though. No, I mean, sorry, continue on the coup thing, but it's just like it's the inconsistency in how the United States continues the Monroe Doctrine in many ways is always like infuriating to me, and that's just another great example of it in like Haitian history specifically. So sorry.
Yeah, and so Papa Doc Duvalier, who was the dictator of Haiti in the middle of the 20th century, and his son continuing, Baby Doc Duvalier continuing until the 80s, um, that dictatorship really served the United States well in terms of being a very a counterbalance against communist Cuba in the Caribbean during that period. And so you see that anti communist legacy really spreading to the deposition of Aristide in the 90s, which is technically after the Cold War, but still we have the United States tampering in what was, by all accounts, a free and fair election of Aristide. Um, so you have this tampering. You've got people like Hillary Clinton acting as Secretary of State who endorse people like Michelle Martelly, who then go on to endorse Jovenel Moise, who, uh, wrapping all the way back around to what I was talking about, this contested election uh, with the OAS and the United States. So the United States claims there's no fraud going on here. The OAS says we don't see any fraud going on. However, internal auditors are saying there are some vast discrepancies in these votes that we need to get a handle on, and so we need to redo round one of our election. Well, the United States doesn't like that, and John Kerry was actually quoted,
Not a friend of the pod.
good old John Kerry. Uh, he was quoted as saying, "The Haitian players, the so called leaders, need to understand there's a clear limit to the patience, the willingness of the international community to condone this process of delay." Imagine any country telling the United States uh, after finding suspicious activity, voting activity in the United States. Imagine, Britain saying, "We refuse. This is the international community will not tolerate this."
It's amazing to watch how the international community has handled our own voting problems that we have had recently. They're not necessarily voting problems, but the like contested nature of our election, because it's something that we would definitely hail as a sign of like a dying democracy that we need to go help in some way. And like at the same time, there's not, I mean, you see a little bit of it from the international players you would expect, but it's not like our allies aren't really pointing to it. It's kind of like hoping it goes back to normal. But it's interesting to me, like how are statements like that going to be taken in the future? And like the more important dynamic is the one that you described, though, of like that's not even a question that we have to ask really, because the international community won't put the United States in that situation or say things like that just because of the power imbalance that's inherently at play with a country like Haiti. And it like I don't know, when you tie it into just like the history that you described and how that's playing out right now, it's pretty infuriating coming from someone like John Kerry, and just generally that political project is disappointing.
Yeah, I mean it's patronizing. It's quite frankly racist.
For sure.
I I don't think that the United
The
States would
so-called
release this
leaders.
kind of the so-called Haitian leaders. The like it it's really infuriating.
For sure.
But going on from this, these are contested elections, and there's a series of civil unrest that goes on. There are several natural disasters, including Hurricane Matthew, which occur after this. And so eventually the second round of elections takes place, but it's all the way in October of 2016. And this is where we get to that central problem that I was talking about there being a constitutional crisis, because technically the president was supposed to be inaugurated on February 7th, 2016, and we're not seeing even the second round of voting occurring until October of 2016. And so there's an interim government put in place by Michelle Martelly during that period, from February 7th, 2016 to February 7th, 2017.
And Moise didn't play any role in that interim government, right?
No, he didn't play an official role. The party of the presidency, obviously,
Yeah,
Petkale, was in the position of being in the interim government. However, Moise himself was not in the interim government.
no, yeah, and that was just for my own clarification because it seems like um I don't know. If he was there, obviously the whole argument falls apart. But like that's just like on my own thing because it does seem like it is just blatant. Like when you look at it from a political party perspective and the way you laid out, like this was a hand chosen successor of a hand chosen politician in many ways, championing a particular political project in the like Clintonian neoliberal sense, and you like add all that out and like put it as one entity, the political party trying to like stretch out an extra year out of their administration and all of the anti-democratic things they did to do so, as we'll get into. But it's just like that seems, I don't know, I'm on a tangent now, but it seems like important context, especially just given that the constitutional crisis is like important and at its core the cause of the unrest here.
Right. And so eventually what happens is that during this election, uh, Moise is confirmed with over 50% of the vote to be the next president of the country. Haiti is a two-round system voter, so if you need to get an absolute majority of votes, meaning 50% plus one vote. He ends up receiving 54.5% of the vote in the second round of elections. So he is inaugurated on February 7th, 2016, as the president of Haiti. Now, skipping all of the context in between, because I think we'll go back to exactly what's happening on the ground
For
and
sure.
the all of the civil unrest that follows, because it's not just right now that Haiti has been experiencing civil unrest during the
Definitely.
Moise presidency. It's been throughout his presidency, and for good reason. But jumping forward into this moment now of February of 2021, what Moise and his loyalists are arguing is that because there was an interim government for a full year from February 7th, 2015 to February 7th, 2016, that means because the Haitian presidency is a 5-year term, that his mandate is actually over February 7th in 2022.
And that right there is the core of this entire thing, like the entire political crisis. Like as you said, there's broader crises that are gripping Haiti at any given point throughout Moise's administration, but that year distinction is the rub here.
Right. So he's saying, my mandate is not over. I had a 5-year mandate. Whereas the Constitution says that it doesn't matter if the president is inaugurated on the first day of their mandate or not, that the mandate is a 5-year mandate from a specific date. So that specific date would have been in 2016, meaning that his mandate is over as of last week.
And the opposition on the ground, I guess maybe it's a good time to turn to what it's like on the ground a little bit, because what has enabled that contestation, despite the Constitution being clear that his mandate is over, and what has enabled the administration to try and hold on, and what does the opposition trying to end the mandate with the Constitution, like, or as the Constitution would mandate, like what does that opposition look like?
It comes down to the fact that, and we talked about this before we started recording, that I really see both Michel Martelly and Jovenel Moise as very Trumpian figures in Haiti, because they really work on eroding the norms and institutions within the government. Things like Jovenel Moise is known for, when a mayor's term is up, he'll just replace them. He will really put forward a replacement, and there will be no elections held. He has messed with the norms in the sense of the parliamentary elections have been delayed and moved around, successors chosen by hand rather than elected by the people. These are all things that he's done in order to erode these norms within the government. And now that we have this constitutional crisis upon us in Haiti, what is happening is that he's using that erosion and he's doing even more crazy. The best way that I can describe what's going on is, imagine that Supreme Court Justice John Roberts was elected by the opposition party to be president because Trump decided that he wasn't going to.
Well, he just calls balls and strikes, so that's good. We can get behind that.
But then imagine if Trump just fires 3 members of the Supreme Court who are against him. Even though he constitutionally cannot do that, imagine that he did it anyway. And imagine if he had them arrested. That's exactly what's going on in Haiti right now.
I want to say that doesn't seem as far fetched as it might have like 6 months ago, but the United States hypothetical. But I think, and I think that that's why it's important to talk about what's happening in Haiti. Obviously, Haiti itself needs, like, people should pay attention to Haiti because it's important. But I also think that, like, there's a sense that, like, that sort of thing only happens in countries like Haiti, and obviously, like, there is a particularly, like, there's particulars of the history and the context of Haiti, but at the same time, like, the erosion of democratic society can happen in the United States, as we should probably be aware of right now. And I guess just like the thought of, like, Donald Trump firing half the Supreme Court, like, doesn't seem as out there
Right?
as it might have in the past.
It's not so far fetched as many people might think, and I think that we've come uncomfortably close to that point, especially in the last 4 years,
For sure.
of realizing that our ideas of the superiority of American government, even those tacitly held by people like us who are not, by far, not like the most,
Wait, you
nationalistic,
had your
we're the
pocket
best.
constitution out before we started recording. Like, come on.
Even those ideas that are kind of subconsciously ingrained in us from a young age, of just by virtue of being raised in a very propagandistic school system of the United States. Like, those
For
ideas are
sure.
really challenged. So that is uncomfortably close to something that might have happened had things, had the cookie crumbled a little bit differently.
Yeah. No, and it's like, again, not to lose sight of the fact that it's actually happening in Haiti and people are dealing with those consequences, but
Right.
that
So that is what's happening in Haiti, is that the opposition has banded together and they put forward the head of the Supreme Court in Haiti as the opposition uh, party president, who was supposed to take over and usher in elections. Now, Moise has been arresting dissidents, and there was this half-cooked kind of plot where a bunch of dissidents were arrested, and then the national police said that there was a conspiracy to assassinate Moise. Now, the photos, if you end up finding the photos online of what the weapons were that they thought they were going to supposedly overthrow the government and assassinate Moise, it was like a rusty machete, a condom, a ballpoint pen, like a
get them
rusty pistol from like the 1950s.
seems
I
legit.
mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's clearly things that they just found in these people's homes and were like,
There we
"Well, this
go.
is it.
Yeah,
There we go. There's our evidence." So, they're arresting doctors, lawyers, the former mayor of Port-au-Prince. There's a warrant out for his arrest right now because he's a member of the dissident party. And so all of these erosions have really culminated into what's really amounting to a purge of political dissidents in the country. And not only political dissidents, but journalists are being targeted. I mean, there was a video going around that you can find these videos on Twitter. It's not very hard because there are a lot of citizens who are posting these things online. But there's a video going around on Twitter of a national policeman firing a tear gas canister into an open window of a journalist's car after he identified himself as a journalist to the police. So these are things that are happening in the country that, again, are the result of these eroding institutions and the fact that for a very long time the country has not had security. It hasn't had. It's kind of this crony, gangster. Well, I'll cut that out. For a long time, the country hasn't had security because there's been this kind of tentatively forged alliance between the national police and gangs in order to suppress dissent in the country. And this manifests in a lot of different ways, but one of the main ways is that there's been an epidemic of kidnapping for ransom in Haiti over the last year and a half. Beginning at the beginning of 2020, people have been kidnapped, particularly people who are from neighborhoods that are not pleased with the Moise administration, professional people of the professional class, people who work for opposing political parties, people who work for human rights organizations, people who are doctors,
and so
that sort of
just
thing.
for just to like get more context, I guess, like if for people on the ground in Haiti, it's understood that there is that like the kidnapping and the politics of the day are interlinked in a fundamental way in some ways.
Absolutely. I mean, uh, in fact, there's a quote, Pierre Esperance of the Haitian National Human Rights Defense Network specifically said, quote, "That is why gangs have become powerful, arrogant, because they are protected by the administration, armed with weapons, money, and ammunition, involved in massacres, murders, and kidnappings." So there is a knowledge that this is linked to the government. That if the government is not outright handing these people ammunition and money, that they're at least tacitly allowing this to happen.
And like what's the scale here, like at what level, because this is like when this is one of the main, like if you read human rights reports on Haiti, as I was doing because I'm a good researcher obviously, but like but when you do, it's the kidnapping issue is pretty fundamental to a lot of the critiques of the human rights situation in Haiti. And I guess to like what's the scale here, and how does what's happening now sort of differ from the backdrop of the last couple years in the face of those eroding institutions?
I don't have the particular statistic in front of me, but I know that in 2019 there were about 30 kidnappings in the country.
Yeah.
Compare that to 2020, where at the end of the year we were approaching one kidnapping a day. Now in 2021, there have been four kidnappings every day in 2021 in Haiti. So this is like really approaching epidemic proportions in the country, where these kidnappings are becoming more and more frequent. They're demanding the equivalent of tens of thousands of US dollars for the return of people's relatives and loved ones. And the what really happens is just these gangs make money. And according to Esperance, who I quoted earlier, he says that the kidnappings have increased because the administration hasn't been giving them money. That is his claim and the claim of many people in the country.
In terms of like the political situation, what I guess what has the response been with the, because the knowledge that this is like a political, this is a political manifestation in some way, and it's not just like crime or whatever, it's in a general sense, even though it obviously is, but like what has the response from the Haitian people been like to combat that, and I guess how does that play into what's happening specifically right now?
I mean, there's a lot of just fear. I mean, there's not a
Understandably, for
lot
sure.
of I from what I've seen, I'm sure that there is resistance and I just haven't seen it. But from people I've spoken to in my life and things that I've read online, people are just afraid to leave the house. They're afraid to go to the grocery store around the corner. They're afraid to wear anything that might indicate that they have any amount of cash, because those are the people who are being targeted for kidnapping, is people who they think they can make a quick buck off of.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of fear and a lot of behavioral changes in the people of just I can't leave the house, because I mean it's happening in broad daylight. They're not even waiting until nighttime. It just people truck rolls up, stuffs you in the back, and you're gone. And so it's a really scary time for people in the country, and they feel like they have no recourse because the government pays lip service that, oh, these kidnappers will be brought to justice. However, we aren't seeing uh, the police force, the national police force, actually uh, taking any major actions to curb the kidnappings and the violence that is being perpetrated by these gangs.
definitely. And it seems like the political incentives are such that like that is a hard ask in the face of like the consolidation of power there, and really I guess going back to that, like with all of that context and all of this happening on the ground, like how, what does the international response at this moment in time look like? And is there any hope that a Biden administration is helpful in some way, or is that just kind of like in a lot of areas probably wishing too big?
I think that the only way that Biden can help the situation is if his administration actively begins to condemn the Moise administration, that they roll back their announcement that which happened last week, is that they announced, the Biden administration announced that the mandate of the president of Haiti would remain until 2022. He needs to roll that back and say, no, the mandate actually ended this year. That is what constitutional experts in the country have said, and that is what is true. And it's a tricky question of what you do next, because obviously the United States and other countries like Canada and France have not had a great track history
Yeah.
uh, in in Haiti of actually defending human rights. And so what we don't want to do is
Well, and there's like a
perpetrate.
really perverse relationship in the sense that like if they start upholding human rights and like development and like doing things correctly on some level, the like wedge that it provides in the OAS, in the geopolitical like arena that is North American politics, like it just like kind of ceases to exist if they don't play the way they have been, I guess. And it's like really, I don't know, sorry to cut you off, but it's just really unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate. And what we don't want to do is perpetrate these neo-imperialist and neo-colonialist ideas that other nations can come in and save
For
Haiti
sure.
from itself. because Haitians are on the ground demonstrating and saying right now, enough is enough. You have expired your mandate, and we are going to elect a new president. And they've been doing that for days now. In fact, they've been doing it for years. There have been large, wide scale protests in the past calling for his resignation over various scandals. And what we're not here to say is that the Haitian people are not actively working for this themselves,
Definitely.
because they are. And the tricky question is, when you have a country that has such a precarious nature to it in this moment in time, what is it that the international community can do without overstepping its bounds? And I think that it's a question that I don't necessarily have a good answer for.
You
I'm not
become John
a
Kerry very quickly if you're an American politician trying to wade in here.
The answer eludes me because I don't know what the answer is. I think that a good first step, like I said, is for the Biden administration to recognize that Moise is unlawfully holding the office of president currently, and to immediately call on new elections.
For sure. And I guess on the new election point and back to, the Haitian people are on the ground doing it. Like, can you speak to some of those previous protests, what those have looked like? And like, maybe this is a little too prognosticating, but like the potential for something like that. Because there's been talk of a general strike. There was talk of like transit workers striking in Haiti. But it seems like on some level, the situation's devolved to the point that I don't know, like, and I'm very limited perspective, but it seems like it it may be like too little too late on some level for that, but like the type of demonstrations you were discussing against the administration in the past, what have those looked like? And like what can is there hope for that sort of thing in the face of like the kidnapping, in the face of like the real costs of dissent in Haiti right now? Because it's understandable that people are living in fear given the situation on the ground, and political organizing is hard in that sort of environment.
Right. And I think that what they're doing is extremely brave right now, because there is such a
For sure.
high cost to dissent in the country right now. And every single person who is out there demonstrating is doing something so extremely brave and important. But in the past, what the past has looked like
Yeah.
in terms of demonstration and protests. And one thing that you can point back to is that in May of 2019, there were tens of thousands of people who went on strike and flooded the streets for 6 whole months. I mean, 6 straight months of demonstration, because it had come out that Moise had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars personally, and that millions and millions of dollars had been misplaced in terms of the PetroCaribe program, which, if you don't know what the PetroCaribe program
Just
is,
lost all that money. Just lost it.
you just misplaced it. You know when you put it in the washer and it ends up in the lint trap and you forget to look, and it's a nice surprise for later, but
Just those millions and millions of dollars.
millions and millions of dollars in your lint trap. Just look there. Um, but the PetroCaribe program is a program that is, or I should say, rather was, before the situation in Venezuela reached kind of a critical point, was a program by Venezuela in which Venezuela provided less financially solvent countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America with oil um, at very preferred prices. And those loans were to be deferred over 25 years at very, very, very low interest rates. Now, the money that Haiti was taking in by selling this very, very, very cheap oil, the agreement of PetroCaribe was that it was supposed to do things like fund hospitals, schools, roads, infrastructure, things like that. What actually happened is that much of that money was embezzled and stolen by government officials, including Moise. Um, Before he was even president, he actually was accused of embezzling funds from the PetroCaribe Fund, because he was listed as the head of a business that was going to be building a highway um, in the country. And the contract was actually dispersed twice to the same company, but with two different people listed as the head of that company, and one of which was Moise.
At what point did the like petty corruption, and that's not petty corruption, that's big scale corruption, but like at what point does that become like this more uh I don't know, this more unstable, like violent political situation that like, genuinely like leaves people afraid to respond in the ways you need to like wrest your country from that level of organized corruption, because it seems like again, I want to go back to the point you said that like the people on the ground right now are incredibly brave because the situation like has developed in such a way that that level of bravery is required, and the like mass movement, thousands of people on strike in the streets for 6 months style of politics like isn't possible necessarily in an environment like, well, and this isn't even mentioned a pandemic, but like in an environment where 4 people a day are being kidnapped for explicitly political reasons sometimes. And it's I guess, what at what point did that really deteriorate? And do you, I guess, is especially given the backdrop of the pandemic, like is that sort of action even possible in the face of what's happening? And like, again, not to like undermine anybody on the ground at all in any way, because it is just a grave situation. And again we didn't even really touch on the fact that a pandemic makes all of that extra difficult.
I mean, the pandemic is just a whole different layer on top of what's going on. People are still massively mobilizing despite the pandemic, in the same
For
way
sure.
that during the summer, last summer, the United States was mobilizing despite a pandemic, after the death of George Floyd. And I think that this is very similar, that people are looking at the pandemic and they're looking at the dangers, the very real dangers of state violence against them. And they're saying that this is more important and that I need to go out and protest. And so these massive mobilizations are still occurring despite the danger of the pandemic, despite the danger of state force against them. And so we have yet to see whether or not this is actually capable of forcing Moise out of office, or at least
Well, and
putting him.
his mandate just ended, so not to put too much pressure on the people of Haiti. You can keep it up, but this is a like day by day thing at this point still, is I guess
Absolutely.
is the point I'm trying to make.
Hmm. But the Moise administration has showed no signs of slowing down their claim that this mandate is going to continue until next year and potentially well into the future. We don't know what he's going to do tomorrow, let alone a year from now, when his mandate, he claims that his mandate is actually up.
Yeah, is there any sense that that would actually be the case? Like if things settled down and it just didn't work, and the February 2022 mandate becomes the de facto like way of the rule of the land rather, like what is there any hope that he would actually step down, or just given the erosion of institutions, given what's happening on the ground, like it seems like a hard sell at this point from my
I
perspective,
mean,
but
that's the fear, really, is that, we have these eroded institutions and he's already broken what the Constitution says is. Sorry, my dog is. I don't know if you can even hear that, but he's very angry about the state of affairs in Haiti right now, clearly.
as he should be.
Um, but the uh, the fear here is that during this period of time, if he's not going to back down, if state violence against protesters increases, if there does reach a point where people say, this isn't worth my life, and they take the pressure off, then, that he will stay until 2022. And that perhaps in February of 2022, he says, actually, my mandate says this, and there will be no election, because it's just this backslide into authoritarianism, because the norms and structures of government have been so eroded. And so there is a very real fear on the ground that that is going to happen.
And I guess this isn't, again, not to make too much of America's role in this, but like at that point, do you think the geopolitics of it remain how they were for much of the 20th century, where it's just advantageous to have a strongman dictator in Haiti as long as they toe the OAS and American line, or the American line within the OAS and more generally internationally? And like, do you think that remains the case, or does the commitment to democracy that America definitely always has, like, will that prevail? Because I do think there is something just on the face hypocritical about how the United States responds to, obviously, responds to pro-American strongmen, and particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America, versus, someone like that is painted as a strongman like Maduro or AMLO even, or any leftist leader that we've talked about on the podcast in the past.
What I think happens, and you shouldn't put any money on this, but
I'm betting the farm on it, Chel.
well, then I better be right. What my bet is that if he ends his mandate in 2022 and the United States puts enough pressure on him, that he'll do what Michelle Martelly did, and he will hand select a successor, that the party is still going, the continuity of power is going to be precisely the same as it was. The party that was in power will still be in power, and he still will be in that inner circle of people who are getting kickbacks from all of the embezzlement that's going on. Um, and we will nominally say that we have preserved democracy in the country of Haiti because he stepped down and he kept his word, and he said that his mandate ended, and we have replaced him with somebody else who is actually precisely the same.
That seems reasonable. And, like, I don't know, from my perspective, like, probably the most likely thing, just given the level of, like, backlash we're seeing right now. I would just imagine that a year from now, if this doesn't shake out in a way that Moise is overthrown and his mandate actually already ended, then I would guess, like, it seems pretty likely there would be continued opposition there, just given the history
Exactly.
here and
I mean,
everything.
Haitians love to mobilize in the streets. It's one of their favorite things to do, and I love them for it. Um, they love, like, I mean, I shouldn't say they love it. They're very good at it. I don't know if they love it or not, but they definitely are very good at it. They're very proficient at it.
Yeah, it seems like something that if you do love, it's very begrudgingly. Like, I wish I didn't have to do this, but I'm good
Exactly.
at it, damn it. Yeah. No, I guess before we wrap it up, do you have any extra context, anything generally you want to say about, like, Haiti and what's going on there, or the history just generally? I mean, the floor is yours, Cho.
Oh, well, so broad. I guess I just want to say Haiti is such an important country. If you're not paying attention to Haiti, you should be. It's the very first Black republic in the world, the very first country to emancipate itself of slavery through a slave revolt, the only country, in fact, to do so through a slave revolt. Uh, the history of Haiti is the history of Black people in the Americas, and so if you see today that Haiti is disenfranchised and that it is in a precarious position, it is only because the dominant Western powers of the United States and other places in the world have kept it in a precarious position. And that the precarious position of Haiti is the precarious position of all Black people in the Americas.
Power to Haiti and all Black people in the Americas. Thank you, Chel. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you want to help us bring you more wonderful content like this, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. We can have lots of conversations with Chel and other people in the future. Someday we'll have a Trevor COVID update. Lots of content to come. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all your support. Follow us on social media. Join us on Patreon, patreon.com/Millennial-Review. We'll see you next time.